Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast live stream, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and organize around the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on. And, on everybody's mind right now, of course, is this Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I have to say, it's weighing heavily. Besides from the larger context, right here in Syracuse, we have the highest concentration, or fourth highest concentration of Ukrainians among the 100 largest U.S. cities. There's 7,000 Ukrainians here. And of course, this is very personal for them. I've been in touch through mostly Signal, which is this encrypted communication system. A Ukrainian Green that we talked to, he's now bearing arms and his city's under bombardment. There was a Russian environmentalist that we talked to before the war on Signal, and he's fled Russia. He's in one of the stands, which is not the safest place to be because it's allied with Russia. He's trying to find somewhere else to get. And for the rest of us, for all of us, if we're not Ukrainian or Russian, if you're on the left in Russia, you basically got to go underground. It's a very dangerous situation. I mean, Thursday night, there was a drone that went out of control and flew all the way across Hungary and Romania and crashed in Croatia near a campus. It destroyed what it said was 40 cars, no people, thank God, but it's Russian made. The Ukrainians have been using them, supplied by Turkey, but both Russia and Ukraine deny it was their drone. And who knows? But you can see from this incident how unplanned accidents, inadvertent incidents, misunderstandings could make this war go much wider and nuclear. And so, this is something that we've got to do something about. Now, of course, we demand, Russian troops out. They invaded, and we need to be in solidarity with the Ukrainians. I think for us in the U.S., that means opening up our migrant quotas, which are, we only had 14,000 immigrants last year. That's as low as during the Trump period. We need to provide material aid to the refugees, of course. One demand that's come out of the Ukrainian left, the Democratic and Eco-Socialist Social Movement, it's called, capital S, capital N, Social Movement, and has been picked up by the radical socialist left across Europe, is to demand the cancellation of Ukraine's foreign debt, much of which is with the IMF. The U.S. has a lot of influence there. Ukraine needs that for medical supplies, housing, people on the move, trying to get away from the fighting. And of course, when time comes, reconstruction. That's $125 billion in debt. That should just be canceled. I have no problem with, any country that can provide these Javelin anti-tank missiles, Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, and drones like Turkey's provided. The U.S. could provide them, or somebody in Western Europe. So these people in Ukraine can defend themselves, because I think any hope of getting to a negotiated settlement means Russia's got to get, suffer losses and get bogged down. Because right now, every indication is they're ready to do to Ukrainian cities what they did to Grozny in Chechnya or Aleppo and homes in Syria. So that's just a reality. But for us in domestic politics, the hard part will be getting our government to take Russia's legitimate security concerns about NATO expansion seriously. And I think that in the end, if it's going to be a settlement, it's going to mean Ukrainian neutrality, as Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, broached this week. He even, said we're ready to talk about the status of Crimea and the Donbass provinces, which Russia has grabbed. And have that neutrality this time enforced by a UN peacekeeping force, which is something the social movement in Ukraine has been calling for since January, before the war. In that case, it was to police the settlement in the Donbass provinces. But that I think is the framework around a peace settlement could be had. And it would really go back not to the Minsk agreements, to the Budapest Memorandum, where the US and Russia and France and Germany and England, the big powers agreed to protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange for it giving its nuclear weapons. At that time, they were the third largest possessor of nuclear weapons after the Soviet Union fell apart. And they gave those to Russia. And in return, they were supposed to be their independence and sovereignty supported. And obviously, that's not the case. So I think, that's the kind of settlement that could be negotiated. And if we can get that far, we got to keep pushing. I'm talking about us as Greens, because the Democrats are as militaristic as the Republicans. We got to demand that then, once Ukraine is settled, we need a new European-wide security framework to replace NATO in the West and the Collective Security Treaty Organization that Russia leads, with basically the stands. It's not nearly as strong, but it's there. And come up with a security framework that everybody's involved in. And then from there, disarming or cutting back conventional and nuclear arms and pulling them back from the borders so the launch times aren't so quick. And keep moving from that toward complete and mutual nuclear disarmament under the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I mean, if this doesn't motivate us and the world to begin that process seriously, sooner or later, these nukes are going to kill us all. So I think that's what we got to push for. I have to say that I'm not optimistic until, the Russians are really bogged down in Ukraine, because Putin and his closest leadership circle are motivated by more than just the geopolitical security concerns. You read Putin's speeches over the last year, he doesn't regard the Ukrainians as a nationality. He blames it on Lenin and his support and the Bolshevik support for the right of nations to self-determination. They're really imperialists. They're great Russian chauvinists that want to restore the Russian Empire, not the old Soviet Union, the Russian Empire of the czars. I mean, they are really right-wing. That's why Putin has been the sort of the hero of the white nationalist right around the world. And I'm afraid these far-right imperialist visions on the part of the Russian leadership is motivating them more than their security concerns, which is why, the Ukrainian resistance to show them that they just can't do that is so important. But whether or not a settlement with Russia on Ukraine can be achieved with Russia's current leadership, Greens, we have a very difficult task in challenging the militarism that the Russian invasion has stimulated in the US, the NATO countries. And of course, US imperialism is engaged in its own wars, which it also calls military operations. They don't say we're at war. We have military operations in Iraq and Somalia, and we're supporting, the Saudis in Yemen. And, the US, tries to take the high ground now, but it rings hollow for a lot of people around the world, because we invaded and bombed the hell out of Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, supporting the Saudis in Yemen and other countries. But we do know that the kind of peace policies that Greens advocate are not going to be advanced by the Democrats or the Republicans. And that's why I think it's so important that we run Greens as anti-militarist, pro-peace candidates. Periodic demonstrations are not going to make much difference, because the Democrats are just going to ignore them, because nobody's competing for the peace vote unless the Greens do. And if they have that competition, it's going to force the Democrats to compete for that vote and move the debate and hopefully the policies. So that's what I've been thinking about, where we're at on this Ukraine situation. Demand the troops out, push for real negotiations. And I think we have to understand that the Ukrainian resistance, it's like the Vietnam War. There are three ways we got to the end of that war, three key factors. One was the resistance of the Vietnamese themselves. And I'm tired of hearing pacifists say, oh, we got to oppose US given arms or NATO to the Ukrainians. When we were in the anti-Vietnam War movement, we never demanded that Russia and China stop providing arms to the North Vietnamese Army or the National Liberation Front in South Vietnam. Our demand was out now. And that's all we should be saying to Russia, out now. And the Ukrainians have a right to, defend themselves and we shouldn't be telling them what to do. We should be creating the conditions where we can get to a peace settlement. So, but the militarism that's spreading around the West because of Russia's invasion. There's another collateral, another. It's the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which is ready to ink. It could be collateral damage now because the Russians in the last week have demanded that the U.S. give them in writing assurance that the sanctions will not restrict their trade with Iran, which is kind of strange. And the U.S. and Iran are ready to sign this renewed Iran nuclear deal. Iran obviously wants the sanctions lifted. The U.S. wants Iranian oil back on the market to replace Russian oil. Now, Russia's role in the treaty is to take Iran's excess enriched uranium and convert a nuclear power plant in Iran back to a research facility so it can't be producing enriched uranium. It could be used for a bomb. Now, China or Britain or France, even the US, so I don't think Iran would accept that, could take those tasks on. But the question now is whether China is willing to sign on a deal without the Russians, and whether Iran is willing to defy the Russians, who are a neighbor on their border and an ally on a lot of international things. So Russia's thrown a monkey wrench in that deal, which is a shame because, we've not only got to when we get to the European-wide security framework, we got to renew the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty, which the U.S. unilaterally pulled out of. And the first step that can give us momentum is this Iran nuclear deal. And we're just on the edge of getting this signed, and it's a damn shame that it might get, kicked to the side because of this war in Ukraine and Russia's last-minute demands. So another consequence of the war, or something that's made worse, is inflation. And of course, the primary issue is supply bottlenecks. The COVID lockdown and then the restart revealed those, and now the war and the sanctions that go with it are going to create new bottlenecks in grain, oil and gas, ocean shipping. And one of the causes of inflation is not just the bottleneck, but corporate price gouging by the corporate oligopolies, in grain supply, the oil gas companies, and including OPEC. We know the fracking oil and gas companies have been holding back production to keep prices high even before this war broke out. Ocean shipping is basically 4 companies. And then we got other industries like, the drug industry. This, even though over 80% of the people want it, the politicians we got won't allow Medicare to negotiate lower drug prices. There'll be a lot of talk about interest rates. Now, the low rates we've had over the last decade have grossly inflated stocks and other asset prices. They're way over the fundamentals, the price earnings ratio. Sooner or later, they're going to come back down to earth. But to increase interest rates, which the Fed is talking about, will not only cause those asset prices to deflate, which is going to hurt the rich and their investments and their willingness to invest in new plant and production, but it also increased the cost, particularly of housing, home mortgages, and so forth, and business investment generally. And so, monetary policies is, what the federal government is looking at. Low rates will not increase the supply because business investment was already down even before COVID because of low profit rates. That's just part of the capitalist system. There's overproduction. They don't have profitable outlets, so they hold back investment. There's excess capacity. There's not the demand to buy all the stuff they could produce. But we don't want high interest rates either, because that will create unemployment, which will reduce the bargaining power of workers. And, these mainstream economists claim we have to do this to stop runaway inflation, create a depression. But in reality, it's to preserve profitability to the extent there is profitability. We also have to understand it's not wages. It's not a wage price push type of inflation because real worker wages, inflation adjusted worker wages, are now below pre-COVID levels, while at the same time profits as a share of the gross domestic product are up. Nor is it increased retail spending by consumers. That might have been true early in the post-COVID, post-lockdown increase in spending, and people were buying goods instead of services because the goods were available, the services weren't. But the real inflation-adjusted spending of consumers is down because of price hikes in food and energy and housing and across the board. So what should we as Greens be talking about to deal with inflation? In contrast to the interest rate manipulation up or down that the Democrats and Republicans are going to talk about. Well, we want to raise supply. I think that means, and this should be part of the, sanctions on Russia, is to lift the oil sanctions on Iran and Venezuela. And apparently that was under discussion, with both countries. With Venezuela last week, in Venezuela, we had diplomats down there talking with the Maduro government, and in Iran in relation to this Iran nuclear deal. We need to build up domestic supply chains. Globalization, neoliberal globalization, I think has hit a wall, and particularly because of this war. But it was something that even Biden talked a lot about. We need to, have more domestic production. Even Trump talked about it. Everybody knows that. So how do we do that? Well, the Greens have the Green New Deal. Massive investment in clean energy and an economic bill of rights for things like healthcare and education and housing. And, we can get our scale up production of heat pumps and wind power and solar panels. We can do that in months if we did it on a scale we did during World War II, when the federal government took over a quarter of the manufacturing capacity of the country in order to turn manufacturing, get it focused on producing arms and jeeps and bombers and ships. And within 6 months, they had that stuff pouring out the assembly lines. We could do the same thing right now. Take, for example, electric vehicles, so we're not, burning oil in our transportation system. In the Build Back Better, there were subsidies for the consumer. There was public subsidies to build out the recharging stations. What was missing and what we need is what you might call climate loans, where you'd have a public financing facility. So, because most people can't afford an electric vehicle. Most people are just trying to keep the vehicle they got going. If they do buy a new one, they buy the cheaper internal combustion engine vehicles rather than the electric vehicles. But you can bridge that you could call them climate loans. Have the public give people the money up front at very low or just inflation adjusted interest. In other words, the principal changes with the rate of inflation rather than have, just making money off those loans for the federal government. And people can pay those loans off because once you have an electric vehicle, it's cheaper to charge it with electricity than it is to buy gas to fill up an internal combustion engine. And so the difference between those costs is what can be used to pay back those electric vehicle loans. So, and we can do the same thing with heat pumps in homes, retrofitting homes and businesses and other buildings in other ways. And that's the kind of financing that the public sector should provide, because the private sector is going to want to do it not at cost, like we could do with the public sector, but at cost plus profits. And particularly where there's scarcity, like in housing, they'll gouge. So how do we deal with that gouging? With these corporate oligopolies, there's talk about excess profits taxes, particularly on oil and gas in Congress. That's okay. Antitrust action, that's okay, but it takes time. But I think we should be pushing for socialization, starting with the oil and gas industry. We need the oil and gas in the transition to clean renewables. And then we need those companies to reinvest their earnings from selling oil and gas into clean power. And the only way that's going to happen is if, we make them a public enterprise, and that's what their mission is to do. But there are other areas, drugs maybe should just be, the pharmaceutical industry should be a public utility, because right now they're gouging us. Ocean shipping, if not, they're international companies. I don't know if we could take them over and internationalize them, but we could set up a public company, even an international public company, to compete with them, and again provide the service at cost rather than cost plus whatever profits they can grab in a non-competitive market. So the other thing is we can do social provision of many of the people's necessities rather than have them buy that stuff on the market. Obvious example is health insurance. Medicare for all. It's cheaper than private insurance. Cheaper for us. We pay for it through the tax system rather than our taxes for Medicare and Medicaid, plus our private health insurance premiums and co-pays and deductibles if we can even afford private insurance. So that we can lower the cost of healthcare. We can have our public healthcare system negotiate drug prices if we don't just take over the pharmaceutical industry as a public utility. We can provide public child care. And I'm not talking about having the federal government subsidize private, child care facilities. I'm talking about public child care through the school system. And, we did that during World War II. We've done stuff before that people think is, beyond consideration. And housing is going to be a big issue. A lot of the protections during the COVID lockdown have gone away. Evictions are up, homelessness is up. So obviously rent control. Again, during World War II, we had federal rent control across the board. And then I think something, we talked about, we campaigned for, is expand public housing. Expand it until the private sector has to compete with the affordable rents people can get in public housing. Public housing should be for anybody, not just the poor, although there should be enough slots so that all the unhoused, all the people that need affordable options can get it in public housing. But, middle-class people, blue-collar workers, everybody should be able to live in those public housing facilities if they want to. And a lot of them will want to because the price will be good, the rent will be low. And as we build out this public housing, we can use it as, build it in the most green way possible so that it's very energy efficient, uses clean power. And basically, as people build that, they'll get the skills they need to in any other new housing that's built or buildings that are built or in retrofitting the existing housing stock. So went on a little longer than usual today, but I think those are some ideas I've been thinking about and how to deal with this war and its consequences, like inflation. So I'll be happy to take your questions and comments. Amy L. Sachs, Howie, is it true that the decades-long nonsense regarding post office employee pensions is finally in the crosshairs of Congress and or Biden? If so, what next? Thanks. Yeah, my understanding is the bill that I think it passed. They took off the burden. It was prepaying for the health care for 75 years. So putting what you think healthcare is going to cost your employees 75 years into the future. And they were supposed to pre-fund that. There's no other private company or public agency that has ever been required to do that. They did this about, I think around 2005, if I remember right. And of course, then suddenly the post office is in a financial crisis because it's ridiculous. They were paying for the healthcare of people that weren't even born yet. So I believe this pension post office reform bill that passed got that changed. The problem we got with the post office is this postmaster DeJoy, which we call No Joy in my post office, the clerks and me, because the guy is a disaster. He wanted to get rid of Saturday delivery. He slowed down the mail deliberately. He made it questionable whether mail-in ballots would work in the 2020 election. The guy was appointed by Trump. What Biden has the power to do is appoint governors to the pension board that would fire No Joy's ass. So you ask what's next? It's getting rid of that guy. Right now, he's buying a lot of internal combustion a new fleet of internal combustion post office trucks when we should be going electric. And he said he'd do it if he was given more money. Congress maybe should, but uh, buying internal combustion trucks for the post office in the middle of a climate crisis, and when we want to squeeze Russia for not giving them the market for their oil and gas and coal exports, it's just not the thing to do. So, what next? Let's demand that Postmaster DeJoy get fired. Scout Trooper 164. What is your reply to Hannity saying the U.S. should drone strike Russian convoys? Asking since Secular Talk covered this and could lead to even more deaths. The U.S. doing it. U.S. pilots who would be off Ukraine territory because they're remotely driven. That is engaging U.S. military personnel with Russian military personnel, and that could escalate into World War III and a nuclear end of us all. So Hannity is an idiot. Now, I said earlier that Ukrainians operating drones, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with the U.S., although Turkey's doing it right now, providing them with the drones. And when you say could lead to even more deaths, deaths of who? Russians invading Ukraine? Yes. But if the U.S. engages in and operates those drones, then we're directly at war with Russians, and that could lead to even more deaths and nearly everybody or everybody's deaths in a nuclear war. So that's a bad idea. So yeah, Hannity. I saw a clip. Hannity had to get corrected by Fox's own Pentagon reporter about the so-called biological weapons laboratories in Ukraine, which are really like your county public health departments. They monitor diseases and try to find out if any infectious diseases are spreading and try to stop them. So they have the research equipment to do that. And what's happened over the last 30 years since Ukraine became independent is they did have biological weapons laboratories that the Russian or then the Soviet government ran. And one of the things where Nixon got rid of our biological weapons capacity, I think it was 1969. And I've seen no reports, nobody except the Russians have alleged that we still have it. Meanwhile, the Russians have 3 facilities we know about that they will not allow the international community to inspect. So Hannity saying the U.S., he should have, in this case, been pointing at the Russians, and that Pentagon correspondent for Fox News corrected him, which was good to see. So anyway, Hannity's a fool. Creative Experiments. Howie Hawkins on live stream with Matthew Ho. Howie kept talking about Russian aggression when USA is still invading Syria, and we have no leg to stand on criticizing Russia. At this point, criticizing Russia has lost its meaning since it is now a dog whistle for Hillary supporters who blame Russia for Hillary's loss in 2016. Again, the U.S. is still in Russia. It's still in Syria. And so is Russia, and so is Iran, and so is Israel. That's a international proxy war in Syria. I just made the point in my presentation at the beginning that the U.S. criticism of Russia rings hollow because we have invaded many countries. That doesn't justify Russia's obvious aggressive war against Ukraine. Any self-respecting anti-imperialist that can't say that is one of these people involved in these pro-Russian anti-imperialism of idiots or fools, because they can't understand that there's more than one imperialist power in the world, and any self-respecting person on the left has to oppose all of them. Eric Gray, in your opinion, Howie, why do you think there is so much skepticism toward the Green Party, especially from other socialists? Well, I think because most of the other socialists in this country have dropped one of the first principles of socialist politics, which is class independence. Most of the self-described socialists in the country support the Democratic Party. They support progressives in the Democratic Party. So they're in coalition with the capitalists in the Democratic Party. So I think that's the biggest problem most socialists have with the Green Party. We are independent of the Democrats, and we oppose that capitalist party. Now, the Greens aren't perfect. We don't have, not all of us are socialists. We didn't have a socialist principle in our platform until 2016. We were more a progressive populist party that had socialists in it. But I think the socialists over time have won the debate within the Green Party. For the majority, that doesn't mean every Green Party member is a socialist. So, I think socialists that express skepticism toward the Green Party are looking for an excuse not to take on the Democrats. They're looking for shortcuts inside the Democratic Party. And, so they've got some nominal socialists in Congress who then, cave before the pressure of the corporate Democrats and make a lot of compromises. They're not in opposition. And maybe they're a loyal opposition, but when push comes to shove, they line up with corporate Democrats. So their agenda is not getting advanced inside the Democratic Party. At best, it gets talked about, and unfortunately, what that does is create illusions about the Democratic Party, make it look better than it is. So take the Green New Deal. Okay, AOC takes it from the Green Party, waters it down with Markey, and they introduce a non-binding resolution in the Congress. And then Pelosi never lets them vote on it in the House. And then when McConnell was the leader of the Senate, he let them vote on it. He wanted them to vote on it, so the Democrats would have to go on record on the Green New Deal. And all those damn Democratic senators voted, they abstained from the vote. They said it was a trick. They couldn't say they supported the Green New Deal in principle, even if it was watered down from what the Green Party had been talking about. Except 4 of those senators voted with the Republicans. No, we oppose the Green New Deal. So that's what your socialists do or get inside the Democratic Party. So they're skeptical about the Green Party. I'm skeptical about their socialism. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think of the U.S. suddenly trying to remove sanctions from Venezuela since they can't get oil and gas from Russia? Well, the U.S. doesn't need to get oil and gas from anybody. We're the world's largest producer. The oil and gas we do get from Russia is, I've seen numbers from between 3 and 7% of Russian exports or our import. I guess our imports. Or anyway, it's a small amount. And what we do is refine it because it gets shipped to us from Russia crude. So it's not that we need the oil and gas, it's that we want Venezuelan oil and gas on the world market as a substitute for Russian gas, which is being sanctioned by many countries. So that's what I think is going on. And I think, we should lift the sanctions on Venezuela. I got my criticisms of the Maduro government, but the economic sanctions aren't hurting Maduro as much as they're hurting the people in Venezuela. So let them get those revenues because they got enormous problems. You talk about refugees. What is it up to now? 5 million have left Venezuela over the last decade. That country is really impoverished, and the sanctions are a big part of it. So there are a lot of reasons to remove the sanctions on oil exports from Venezuela. Michael Shin, when you're out deep canvassing, and if the person were to complain about illegal immigrants being given free stuff at taxpayers' expense, how would you proceed? Well, I'd listen. I mean, that's the first thing you do when you're deep canvassing, and say, I would agree with you if illegal immigrants were being given a lot of free stuff, but illegal immigrants or non-documented immigrants can't get any free stuff at the taxpayers' expense because they're not recognized. They can't go and get that stuff. So I think you're wrong, person I'm talking to, about immigrants getting free stuff at taxpayers' expense. They can't go to government agencies and get help because those agencies are instructed not to give those people help. So, and then if I had the discussion went on, I'd point out that these undocumented workers work hard. They do a lot of stuff that people already here in the United States will not do. The dirtiest construction work, the work in the picking the crops, a lot of cleaning and home. People that got what do they call them? Nannies, maids. A lot of the people that do that, or a lot of them do their home health aides, working for agencies that use undocumented people and then steal their wages. So I'd say these are hardworking people, and most people in the United States are descended from immigrants, and so why not let these people do the same thing that the person I'm talking to's forebears probably did. Those are the kind of things I would raise. Um, and so, yeah, you're going to have uncomfortable conversations when you're just knocking on people's doors and, coming up with people that have, views you disagree with. And one thing you can always do is, point out where you think they're wrong factually, like the free stuff given by the government to illegal immigrants. But facts don't always make a difference, because a lot of times that's just an excuse for a prejudice, xenophobic or anti-Latino, or whatever the prejudice motivates their anti-immigrant feelings. It's also scapegoating. A lot of people are scapegoating immigrants for problems immigrants didn't cause, like the loss of decent paying factory jobs in this country. Undocumented workers didn't do that. Undocumented workers didn't take those jobs because they went overseas. It was big business that moved those jobs away. So there are lots of things you can point out in a give and take in deep canvassing. And oftentimes, if you respect the person and don't, denigrate them, but take what they say seriously and try to give them a serious response, they may not agree with you, but they're going to respect the fact that you listened and engage them as a serious person. And politically, a lot of people will end up saying, well, the Green Party, I don't agree with everything they say, but, they come out and talk to us. They listen. They seem like they're sincere. And I can't say that about the other politicians out there. So, hell, I'm going to vote for the Green Party. That's the kind of thing. But the other thing about deep canvassing, and People's Action found this out, doing it with white, rural, likely Trump voters in Georgia, is that, and there's a lot of social science research to support this, deep canvassing is the most persuasive form of political persuasion out there, much better than TV advertising or mailing flyers or having house parties and speeches and rallies. Deep canvassing is the most effective thing. And when we talk about deep canvassing, maybe I should explain that. That's where you go out and you listen more than you preach. You hear what people are saying and listen to their concerns. And then after a while, you try to relate to them and relate to, your, Green Party platform to their concerns. But the main point is to, go out and listen, let them get to know you and begin to trust you. And it should be done on a constant basis. It shouldn't just be a one encounter. It should be, you go back through the same communities again and again. And then people know the Greens are out there. They want to hear what you have to say. They have their ideas, and, you may agree or may not, but at least they're taking you seriously, which you can't say for the Democrats and Republicans. They just get a lot of money and advertise at you when elections come around. Frankie Lee, how is ballot access coming for midterms? Will the Greens be on the ballot in most states? How about Texas? I can't give you a 51 jurisdiction tally. I know we're on the ballot already on 15 states. That's kind of what we came out of 2020 with. I know they're petitioning in North Carolina, to get Matthew Hoh on the ballot. That's really important. It's only about, I think they need about, just under 15,000 good signatures, which means 25,000 signatures to be safe. They got till sometime in mid or late May. So that's definitely doable, but they need help. If you're in the area or in the state, get out there and get some signatures for them. I know Missouri's petitioning, New Mexico's petitioning. I don't know how other states are doing. I can tell you in New York, we got to get 45,000 signatures in 42 days between April 19th and May 31st. That is one of the most difficult petitions, well, the most difficult petition to get on a ballot statewide of any state in the United States. And compared to other countries, it's ridiculous. The U.S. is just terrible compared to other countries. I was actually researching Russia, how their oblasts, which are like their states. And it's the only country I've found where the petitioning requirements are higher. But what they also have is that if your party's registered, you don't have to petition. You just nominate, which we actually have in New York for statewide offices, except president, if you have a ballot line. But that's unusual in the United States. So you can have a convention and nominate. People can still petition to primary you, but anyway, the problem in Russia, though, is getting your party registered, because the United Russia Party, that is Putin's party, controls the electoral apparatus. And I've been looking for another country besides the United States where the governing parties administer their own elections. The United States does that. We have bipartisan county boards of elections, although the Republicans are trying to get that changed and have got it changed in a few states so they can dominate those county boards and the whole election apparatus. There have been some efforts at nonpartisan, but like in Wisconsin, they had it for a while and they repealed it. The Republicans got that repealed. Now they want to get rid of that system for another one that they can control even more. But the only other country besides Russia where, and their boards are controlled proportional to the vote of the previous election. So United Russia, Putin's party, gets the most. The Communist Party, which is a pro-Putin party on its nationalism and its conservatism, not so much on its austerity for public services. That's where the communists have a little argument with Putin's party. But those two parties dominate. And so they dominate the boards of elections. So if you're like the Russian Socialist movement, left-wing eco-socialist party wants to get on a ballot and they get the required signatures and they submit their paperwork. And in this article I was reading, it was in Nature magazine of all places, political science, academic article. There's a mark above the letter. It's kind of like the umlaut in German, but it's another thing. It's in Russian. And this guy on his paperwork had it when it wasn't supposed to be there. So for that reason, they knocked out the whole application for his party. That's the kind of nonsense that goes on in Russia. Here it's more subtle. The only other country I found was Ireland, where they had party administration of elections. But they're in the process, and when I read this a while ago, of getting rid of that and doing like the rest of Western Europe, Canada, Mexico, you name it. They have independent civil service, nonpartisan election administration. So that's kind of a tangent off ballot access. But if you have partisan administration of elections, you have partisan access to the ballot. I mean, we found that out running for president. We had 3 states where we had plenty of signatures to get on a ballot, and those cases went to court. And in every case, or sometimes like in Wisconsin, a commission, and then it went to court. And in every case, at the commission level and at the court level, the district court, and finally the state Supreme Court, everybody voted party line. They're all hacks, judges and election commissioners. The Republicans wanted us on, the Democrats wanted us off. And the facts and the law didn't matter. So that's part of ballot access too. We should be pushing for nonpartisan administration of elections by a civil service agency rather than party hacks that are appointed by the parties. Amy O'Sacks, I'm hoping our local chapter can find a way to deep canvas. We are threadbare and spread out so thinly across a large state, though. There must be a way around this. Well, I think you start in a local. You don't try to do it statewide. In a large state, I'm not sure what state you're in, but do it in your local community. That's where we can have the biggest impact. That's where we can elect a lot of people. We've proven that. And that's, getting that political foundation is a foundation for then running credible campaigns for state legislatures and the House of Representatives. So, yeah, the way around it, I think, is to start local. Because it sounds like your local chapter, you're also equating it with a large state. I say do it in your local chapter and set a good example for other locals around your state. Creative experiments. Do you think the Green New Deal would be twisted and co-opted even further to excuse sanctions against Russia? Well, I think the Green New Deal is a way to make real sanctions against Russia's invasion by replacing oil, coal, and gas from Russia with clean, renewable energy. I don't think it's co-opted. That's what we want to do. The problem with the co-optation of the Green New Deal is that the Democrats took it and got a lot of attention for it, more than the Greens that have been our signature issue throughout the 2010s, and watered it down and, watered it down in the sense that they dropped the ban on fracking, they dropped the phase out of nuclear power, they dropped the deep cuts in military spending in order to help finance the Green New Deal. And they extended the deadline for zero emissions from 2030 to 2050. And then they didn't call it zero emissions, they called it net zero, which is a backdoor way of saying we can continue to burn fossil fuels if we capture the carbon and sequester it, which is a technology that has not proven profitable. So that's how the Green New Deal gets twisted and co-opted. But Bill McKibben had an article that apparently they read, or some people in the administration read it. It was called Heat Pumps for Peace and Freedom. And, they're saying we should up the heat pumps production, get them to Europe so they don't have to import Russian gas to heat their homes next winter. And, he's right. It's the kind of thing we did in World War II. That could be done. That could be done by next winter. It could be done in months. But it would take, and there was like 200 environmental groups last week that urged the Biden administration to do that by invoking the Defense Production Act, which is getting, closer to our eco-socialist Green New Deal, where the federal government would mandate that production. Now, the way Biden would probably do it is, mandate private companies produce it and give them incentives and so forth. We just want to take those companies over and have them run as public enterprises. But in any case, look, I'm for sanctions against Russia as long as they're invading Ukraine, particularly the oil and gas sanctions. Defund the Russian military. Scout Trooper 164, what are your thoughts on Joe Biden demanding people return to the office despite WFH popularity and higher prices for gas? Honestly, it's very tone deaf and ridiculous. Okay, people return to the office despite, I'm not sure what WFH stands for, and higher prices for gas. Look, I think it's, Biden, he wants to declare again, like he did a year ago, that the COVID pandemic is over. And of course, the virus has a vote in that too. And because we have not vaccinated the world, because Biden would not lift the patents and make it available, work from home, okay. Because he didn't do that, new variants can easily develop in the unvaccinated, poor regions of the world and come back to bite us again. There's an article yesterday that this Omicron variant, BA2, it doubled last week in New York. And if it goes on the same steep curve as the first variant, we could have another wave. And just because we declared it's over and you don't have to wear your mask and y'all got to go back to work, that is not based on the science, as they always say they're doing. That's based on the business. That's why the CDC reduced the number of days you're supposed to isolate if you infected, and from 10 days to 5 days. The science hadn't changed, but the business interests lobbied for that. Same thing with lifting the masks. And the Republicans pushed this and the Democrats chased them. And every time the Democrats do that, it kills them politically. Because people say, why should I vote for the Democrats when I can get a real Republican? Scout Trooper 164. What do you think of Sagar and Jetty's comparing the high prices we have today to be similar to the high prices of that of the 1970s? Yeah, I didn't see, where he said that, because so the prices are getting, similar. With the latest figure was 7.9% inflation. I think we got up to 18% toward the end of the 70s, before they had the Volcker depression with those super high interest rates that just killed the economy, and we went into a deep recession. I think there's some similarities in that inflation. It was partly caused by exogenous causes, in that case energy and food, which we're again having now, particularly with Ukraine is a breadbasket. Russia has a lot of grain exports, and how they're going to get out of ports like Odessa in the Ukraine, which is about to be attacked by the Russians this year, is and what I'm hearing from the farmers in Ukraine, they're not going to be able to plant their spring crops. So those are similar. I think what's different this time is that back then you did have wage price spiral that was built into the mentality, because the unions were a lot stronger then, and they were pushing for cost of living adjustments. And then what's similar is the monopoly sector, or oligopolies, would just pass on those wage increases in the form of higher prices to maintain their profit rates. So you got in a cycle. That's different today, because real wages are not increasing and real purchasing power is not increasing. So I don't know what Sagar and Jetty said, but that's how I would compare what's going on today with what went on in the 70s. And in terms of the solutions, like I said at the top, it should be increased supply. The Green New Deal can do a lot of that. We should provide social provision of health care, negotiate, have that public health care system negotiate lower drug prices, or just take over the pharmaceutical industry as a public utility, take over the oil and gas industry so we can provide the gas and oil that we need in the transition at a cost we can afford, but use our earnings and reinvest them in renewables, and those kinds of things. So there are a lot of similarities, not all the similarities, but the policy response has to be better than just creating a deep recession, which will be really hard on a lot of people who are already suffering after what we went through with COVID and that lockdown. Dayback Allison, are there any industries that are moving towards unionizing that you're excited about? Excuse me. Well, I think the fast food industry, Starbucks, but particularly Amazon. And with new leadership in the Teamsters, just about to take office and targeting Amazon, I think that could make a big difference, because that's not only an industry that employs a lot of people in these warehouses and the trucking that goes with it, but they sit in a strategic part of the economy, so that if they go on strike, the economy grinds to a halt. They have a lot of leverage. And I think, your fast food workers can go on strike and you can get food elsewhere. But if the logistics industry, the trucking and the people that deliver your goods decide they're not going to work until they get some demands met, everybody's going to feel that. And if the last big strike like that, the UPS strike in '97, is any indication, the public is going to side with the workers, because the issue then was most of the jobs at UPS were part-time. They'd work people really fast and physically demanding jobs in the hubs for 4 hours rather than an 8-hour job. So they were worn out after 4 hours. But they didn't make 8 hours worth of wages. So the slogan of that strike was part-time America doesn't work, which a lot of Americans could relate to. So I'm hopeful that, very excited for that fight. Warehouse workers have needed unionizing for so long. Yeah, we've had it at UPS. I was a UPS Teamster warehouse worker, but FedEx doesn't have it. I think DHS has it in Europe, but not the United States. And Amazon doesn't have it. Amazon is growing at lightning pace, and that's the key. That's the key company that has to be organized. And there have been workers in I think Staten Island, and is about to have a vote. And the Teamsters are about to engage in that fight in a serious way. So yeah, that's, I think, what I'm most excited about. So another hour passed, it went fast. So I don't really have anything to add from what I said at the top about, we got to oppose the invasion. We got to somehow advance anti-militarist solutions. If we're not saying clearly that Russian troops should get out of Ukraine, that it's an imperialist invasion and there's no excuse for it, we're not even going to be heard when we try to talk about US NATO imperialism, because people aren't seeing that on the TV screens right now. If they know we're against the Russian invasion, then they might hear us out on these other issues. It's not going to be easy, but we need to use this war as an opportunity, because we're on the edge of a possible nuclear confrontation, to move the disarmament agenda. That was one of the three major themes that Angela and I ran on. A Green New Deal, an economic bill of rights, and peace policies, particularly pushing nuclear disarmament. Because if we don't get rid of those nukes sooner or later, particularly if we're living in a capitalist system that generates wars by capitalist countries that have imperialist ambitions and motivations, whether they're the US or Russia, sooner or later, we're going to have that nuclear war that'll kill us all. So, it's terrible what's going on, but it also creates an opportunity if we can take advantage of it and raise, an anti-militarist, pro-peace alternative to the militarism we're going to get from the Democrats and Republicans. It's spreading across Europe. Germany's doubling their military budget. And, other NATO countries are going to increase their budgets. The US, they gave Biden $25 billion more than he asked for. Congress gave him $25 billion more than he asked for. And now with this latest omnibus spending bill, it's up from 768 to 782 billion for the Pentagon. So that a lot of the problems that cause conflicts are not going to be solved. It's like saying you want to stop crime by putting more police on the street. The police can maybe catch criminals if you got good investigators and they're serious about it, but they can't prevent the crime from happening, because they can't be everywhere. And people that are going to be, engaged in crime or countries that are beginning engaged in aggression, having more cops on the beat is not going to stop it. You got to get at the root problems. So in the case of crime, that's poverty in particular. In the case of wars, it's, capitalist competition as opposed to socialist cooperation. So I guess that's saying we need system change, not climate change and not war. So with that, have a good week. Keep fighting, and we'll talk to you next week.